Nixon walked into the 1960 debate looking like a man who had seen a ghost, and it cost him the presidency. It was a multi-million-dollar PR disaster that the Republican Party tried to bury for decades, pretending the radio listeners, who thought Nixon won, were the ones who actually mattered. But the truth is much colder. Nixon was sweating under the studio lights, his gray suit melting into the background, while he wiped his upper lip with a handkerchief. Across from him, John F. Kennedy sat perfectly still. JFK didn't just win because of a tan, he won because he was the first man to treat a press conference like a gladiator arena where he held all the weapons. He stopped pretending to be a stiff politician and started acting like a leading man who didn't give a damn about the script. If this video felt like a slap in the face to everything you were taught in history class, you needed it. Subscribe for the next one to stay sharp. Some people claim Kennedy only dominated because he looked like a movie star, while everyone else looked like a tax accountant. That is a comforting lie spread by people who can't handle real talent. Look at the grainy footage. Watch the way he leans into the podium with a relaxed, almost bored confidence. He wasn't just standing there being pretty. He was dismantling veteran journalists with a single sentence. Look around you at the politicians today who stutter through every teleprompter line and hide behind a wall of advisors. Kennedy didn't need a script because he simply said what he was thinking. Consequences be damned. Subscribe to see how deep the rabbit hole really goes. Others argue the press was on his side and the whole thing was rigged, but the reality behind the scenes was a bloodbath. Balls and he hit them out of the park with a joke that made the room explode in laughter. The flashbulbs were blinding. The air was thick with the smell of cigarettes and desperation. Kennedy didn't hide from the fire. He pulled up a chair and asked for a light. He knew the camera didn't just see his face, it saw his pulse, and his pulse never skipped a beat. You might hear people say Nixon only lost because he had a fever and a bad leg. They claim it was a medical fluke, not a political one. They want you to believe that if Nixon hadn't spent 2 weeks in the hospital with a staph infection, he would have wiped the floor with that young guy from Massachusetts. But that is a story told by people who want to ignore the cold-blooded strategy Kennedy used to bury his opponent alive. Think about it. Nixon walked into that studio looking like a ghost. He refused to wear professional makeup because he thought it was beneath him. He wanted to look like a tough guy, a man of the people who didn't need a vanity kit. Kennedy saw that mistake and pounced. He didn't just accept the makeup, he made sure the lighting hit him at the exact angle to make his jawline look like it was carved out of granite. Look at the two of them on that split screen. You have Nixon, swaying on his feet, his suit a drab gray that blended into the walls until he literally started to disappear. Then you have Kennedy popping off the screen in a dark suit, his eyes locked onto the lens. He wasn't talking to the moderator. He was talking to you. He was looking right into your living room. He knew that if he could win your eyes, your ears would follow. Look around you today and you will see the exact same thing happening on every social media feed. It is not about who has the better policy. It is about who owns the frame. People love to say the press was in his pocket. They claim the media elite just wanted a glamorous couple in the White House. That is a weak excuse for a man who simply didn't know how to play the game. The reality was much more brutal. The reporters in that room weren't fans. They were sharks smelling blood in the water. They asked Nixon about his experience, and he gave them long, winding answers that sounded like a legal brief. They asked Kennedy the same thing, and he gave them a 3-sentence knockout punch. He understood that on television, the man who talks the longest is usually the man who is losing. He kept his answers sharp. He kept his posture perfect. Even when the cameras weren't on him, he knew someone was watching. While Nixon was mopping his forehead and looking at his notes, Kennedy was sitting tall, looking like he was already the president. You sitting there right now, think about the last time you saw someone lose an argument just because they looked nervous. It happens every single day. The truth is that Kennedy invented the modern world of image. He realized that the person who looks the most comfortable is the person who is in charge. Some skeptics will try to tell you that the whole thing was a fluke of the era. They say the country was just bored and wanted something new. But if you look at the raw data, the radio listeners thought Nixon won by a landslide. Why? Because on the radio, you can't see the sweat. You can't see the fear. You can't see the way Nixon's eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal. But the millions of people watching on their grainy black and white sets didn't care about the radio. They saw a man who looked like the future and a man who looked like a tired relic of the past. It wasn't a fair fight because Kennedy didn't want a fair fight. He wanted a total takeover. He turned that studio into a theater where he was the star, and Nixon was just a supporting actor who forgot his lines. The air conditioning in the studio was turned down low, but the lights were pushing out massive amounts of heat. Nixon's shirt was sticking to his back. You can almost smell the tension through the footage. Kennedy didn't blink. He didn't fidget. He stayed perfectly still, knowing that every move he made would be magnified 1,000 times. This wasn't about politics. This was about dominance. This was about showing the world who was the lead and who was the extra. If you think your favorite influencers or politicians today are being authentic, you are falling for the same trick. They are all following the Kennedy playbook. They are managing the lights, the angles, and the rhythm of their speech to make you believe they are effortless. But nothing about that night was effortless. It was a calculated, high-stakes gamble that changed the way power works forever. Subscribe right now if you want to see how these same tactics are being used to manipulate you today. We are peeling back the curtain on the biggest PR stunts in history and the people who got caught in the crossfire. Another lie people love to spread is that Kennedy's family bought the election. They point to the money, the connections, and the backroom deals. Sure, the money helped buy the airtime, but money can't buy the way he handled that first question. He took a complicated issue and turned it into a story about the American dream. He made people feel something while Nixon was busy making them think. In a battle between a feeling and a thought, the feeling wins every single time. Look at the way Kennedy uses his hands. He isn't pointing fingers or waving them wildly like a salesman. He uses precise, small gestures that show he is in total control of his environment. Nixon, on the other hand, was gripping the podium like he was trying to keep it from floating away. He looked like he was bracing for an impact that never came. The real secret of that night wasn't the tan or the suit. It was the fact that Kennedy treated the camera like a friend, while Nixon treated it like an interrogation lamp. One man was invited into the American home. The other man was trying to break into it. The result was inevitable. The moment the debate ended, the poll plan was. They didn't care about his foreign policy experience. They saw a man who looked like he was crumbling under pressure, and they decided right then and there that he couldn't be trusted with the nuclear codes. This is the reality of the world we live in. It is shallow, it is brutal, and it is entirely based on what we see in the first 10 seconds. Kennedy knew this better than anyone. He didn't just win a debate, he murdered the old way of doing things. He replaced the smoke-filled rooms with the bright lights of the television studio. And once those lights were turned on, there was no going back to the dark. Look around you. The world is still screaming for your attention, and the people who get it are the ones who have mastered the art of the performance. If you aren't paying attention to the staging, you are the one being played. Kennedy wasn't a hero or a villain in that moment. He was a master technician. He took the tools of Hollywood and used them to take over the world. And the craziest part? We are still watching that same movie today, just on smaller screens. Don't be the person who gets distracted by the suit. Be the person who sees the hand pulling the strings. Stay tuned, because the truth about how the elite stay in power is much darker than a simple debate win. We're just getting started. Some people will tell you the radio listeners were the ones who actually got it right because they weren't fooled by the visuals. That is a comforting lie people tell themselves to feel smarter than the masses. The truth is much more ruthless. Radio didn't matter anymore. Kennedy knew the world had changed, and he didn't apologize for using every trick in the Hollywood playbook to win. He wasn't there to have a polite conversation about policy. He was there to dominate the screen. Nixon thought he was in a debate, but Kennedy knew he was in a movie. Look at the footage again. Nixon is wiping his upper lip every few minutes, while Kennedy sits perfectly still, radiating pure confidence. It is the difference between a man who is drowning and a man who is walking on water. This wasn't a failure of intellect for Nixon. It was a total failure to understand that the camera never blinks. You need to see the world for what it actually is, not what they tell you in textbooks. Subscribe to prepare your mind for what is coming next year, because the tactics used to manipulate you have only gotten more aggressive. Nixon eventually realized his mistake and spent the rest of his life trying to fix his image, but he could never wash off the stain of that one night in Chicago. He lost the presidency by one of the thinnest margins in history, all because he chose the wrong color suit and refused to wear a little bit of face powder. The man who arguably knew more about global politics than anyone else in the room was defeated by a bottle of Lazy Shave and a high-wattage light bulb. 11 years later, the same man who couldn't handle a TV camera was caught on a secret tape recorder that ended his career forever. He never learned that once the red light is on, someone is always watching. Forget the fairy tales about democracy and civil discourse. The real truth is,